For example, first cousin marriages were fairly common in England in the early 1800s. In fact, wealthy English parents encouraged first cousins to marry to keep wealth and land within the family. And today, well, I don't need to explain that as a society we frown upon first cousin marriages. Hello, Anastasia Harmon here. Thanks for joining me for Left Behind the Scenes. These mini episodes allow me to chat with you about a variety of topics in an informal, close to one-on-one format. In these episodes, I'll give you answers to frequently asked questions about the podcast, descriptions about how I research the people I highlight, details on topics that tie into Left Behind episodes, interviews with individuals in the World War II in the Philippines community, and so much more. So let's get started. Last week's episode about my great-grandfather, Alma Salm, got me thinking. You see, as I talk about in the episode, some people in my family didn't have great things to say about him. These are the older generations, contemporaries of his and his children's generation. His grandchildren have better things to say, and his great-grandchildren, well, let's just say I'm not the only one inspired by him. But working through my great-grandfather's story got me thinking about bad blood across family generations. So I reach out to a lot of POW family members when I'm researching Left Behind episodes. Most of the people I reach out to don't respond to my cold emails or calls. And that's likely for several reasons, including me not finding correct contact information and just people don't often respond to cold calling or email, and so on. But I've sometimes wondered if I've ever contacted someone who didn't have a good relationship with a serviceman or woman, and thus doesn't want to speak about him or her, so never responds to my request. By the time I reach out to a family member, I've done quite a bit of research into the POW as well as their extended family, like wife and children and so forth. In fact, finding a POW's potential family members typically involves me finding out as much as I can about a POW's children, grandchildren, and so forth. And sometimes I uncover skeletons, uncomfortable things, family secrets, if you will. Now, this all sounds kind of creepy of me, and I admit that sometimes I feel like I know too much about a person when I reach out to him or her. At the same time, if I want to find family members, this is what I need to do. And thorough research often involves uncovering the not so happily ever after things in families. So in the cases where I found those not so happy things, I wonder if when I come knocking about creating a podcast episode about a certain POW, if I sometimes come across people who just want nothing to do with that individual. And since this is a podcast about history, and everyone has a skeleton or two of varying degrees in their own history or in their family's history, I thought I'd touch on 7 ways someone interested in learning about their past family members might handle bad blood in their family tree. When my friend Addie, that's not her real name, lost her grandfather several years ago, hidden truths about him regarding abuse came out and shattered the extended family. Addie told me, quote, "I've seen all the effects that abuse has caused, and it's very likely that when someone abuses their family, it's because they were abused. So I wonder how far back does the abuse go in my grandfather's family? I have all of these suspicious thoughts, things I make up when I hear stories about that part of the family." Close quote. So in a case like this, where the emotions are just too raw, the pain still too painful, or the anger too strong, I just skip it. Look for stories about people on another side of your family, or perhaps skip over a specific person and move on to his or her parents, grandparents, or so on. That being said, discovering someone's past can help understand why a person was the way they were, and why they did the things they did. In such cases, learning about someone's life could help heal generational wounds. By the way, I'm not necessarily speaking of abuse, nor am I condoning any type of abusive behavior. In the case of my great-grandfather Alma Salm, I wonder if his deepening religious zealousness stemmed from PTSD related to his time as a POW. Perhaps if his children and adult family members understood this, there could have been more understanding and patience toward him during his last years. And maybe negative stories about him wouldn't have been propagated. As another example, I didn't like one of my grandfathers. He was, in my opinion, a jerk. Last summer, after I shared some witty and clever, not-so-nice stories about him, someone in the group asked me, "I wonder what happened to him to make him act that way." This comment stopped me short and made me realize that I have my own issues with their own root causes, and perhaps I should have a little more compassion for my now-deceased grandfather, and maybe some curiosity as to what could have made him act the way he acted. That leads me to my third suggestion, which is that the passage of time decreases pain. The more removed from pain or embarrassment, the less likely we'll be bothered by it or skittish to research it. This reminds me of comments from several African American friends and acquaintances that their older family members won't talk about the family's history because it's just painful. As we know, African American history in the United States contains a lot of painful things endured by African American families. Segregation, lynchings, Jim Crow laws, racism, enslavement, and more. But I've also noticed that the generations who didn't live through those things are more open to discovering their family's past, pain and all. They are far enough removed from such trauma that the emotions and triggers are lessened or non-existent. And the beautiful thing about this is that by discovering their family's past, my African American friends and acquaintances are reclaiming a stolen history. And that is powerful, because there's just something about feeling tied to your past generations that is empowering for you today. And if this is something that interests you, I suggest episode 30 that talks about the power of multi-generational family stories. It's very interesting, especially the research about it. The farther away from an event that we get, the less embarrassment, pain, fear, or other negative emotion can attack us. And we can gain a better understanding of and compassion for who our people were and why they did things they did. Now, in a quest to tell someone's life story, we might ask people questions that could bring up their own pain, anger, or embarrassment. Emotions that they may not be willing to talk about, share, or revisit. I experienced this a bit when speaking to my grandmother about her father for the last episode. I already knew going into the interview that she didn't have a close relationship with her father, so I made sure to tread lightly and not push her to tell me things. In similar cases, I encourage people to be kind, tread lightly, respect someone's emotions, and don't push for details they're not willing or comfortable to share. Now, even if you and/or other family members are no longer bothered by your family's past painful experiences, offering compassion toward the past people in your family can still be very empowering. This is some great advice. Quote, "When you start searching the past, you have to remember they were humans. They had good, they had bad. But, as still true today, it's not our job to judge them." Close quote. Well said. As we move backward in time, it's sometimes tempting to romanticize distant family members and turn them into paragons of perfection. Or, conversely, see them as villains of the story. I know I do this for a couple of my grandparents. But trying to put ourselves in their shoes and attempting to imagine what their life was like can create great understanding and compassion, and even feelings of deeper personal connections that might impact your own life for good. Someone told me, quote, "I learned my third great-grandfather committed suicide by hanging himself when he was in his 40s, close to my own age now. So I took a couple days break from research after saying a prayer for him." Close quote. A beautiful response for remembering a troubled soul in her family. My seventh and final piece of advice is to consider the time period an individual lived and accept the truth. As hard as it may be to face some things, it doesn't change the fact those negative or embarrassing things may be true. Another family storyteller told me, quote, "A lot of things that happen are just a sign of the times, and we have to understand the environment and mindset at that time," close quote. Now, that is truth. We don't live in the same place, time, or culture as our ancestors. We don't have the same perspective. We don't have the same social and cultural norms. Some painful or embarrassing truths for us today were the norm for our ancestors, like first cousins marrying, to use a fairly light example among many heavy ones I could mention. If you find a painful or embarrassing truth, consider doing some historical or contextual research to see if that action was part of a larger social norm. Such research could offer a new, interesting perspective on the situation. For example, first cousin marriages were fairly common in England in the early 1800s. In fact, wealthy English parents encouraged first cousins to marry to keep wealth and land within the family. And today, well, I don't need to explain that as a society we frown upon first cousin marriages. Sometimes the embarrassing things are only embarrassing because of the time you live in. Here's another example. Australia was settled by English convicts shipped by the Crown to the penal colonies down under. A lot of Australians today are descended from those settling convicts. Now, 50 plus years ago, having a convict in your family tree was a source of embarrassment, a reason to fudge your genealogy and deny your true identity. But the culture's changed. Today, having a settler convict in your family tree is a sort of badge of honor. So, something that seems embarrassing today may not be so embarrassing 50 years from now. The time you live in affects you, and the time your ancestors lived in affected them. Sometimes it's our own perspective that's causing the problems. Well, that's Left Behind the Scenes for today. Be sure to like and subscribe to Left Behind so that you're the first to know when I drop next week's episode, what happened when Japanese forces found and sabotaged the only water supply going to an island fort in Manila Bay. Have a fantastic week.